In the winter, the water's just cold. So there's more mixing because there's cold water on the surface, cold water on the bottom. In the summer, there's warm water on the surface that's heated up by the sun and by the air around it, but the water on the bottom is still really cold, so you get more stratification. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, more phytoplankton makes more hypoxia. On the other hand, which is actually the bigger hand, more stratification makes more hypoxia, because if you have plenty of phytoplankton, right, and plenty of decaying organic matter, and we call that oxygen demand, right, because the decaying organic matter demands oxygen to break down. But if there's plenty of mixing, there's plenty of oxygen supply. High supply plus high demand equals no problems. It's only when you have high demand and no supply, that's when you have hypoxia. It's kind of similar to, the iPhone 6, right? When that thing first comes out, you get them on eBay for $1,000 because there's low supply, high demand. But eventually they keep making them and keep making them and keep making them, and the price evens out, right? The demand doesn't go down because people keep flushing the things down the toilet, but the supply goes up, right?
How has the issue of pollution and dead zones in the Long Island Sound affected the Connecticut people on subjects such as economy, health, weather, and recreation?
Well, I think you guys know the rough answer to that. The answer is that there's a huge impact. We love Long Island Sound. That's why we live here. People come here to visit Long Island Sound because it's a beautiful place to be. If there's dead fish floating in the water, that kind of makes the tourists not really happy. Also, when there's hypoxia, the water tends to smell bad because hydrogen sulfide can form. That's a normal process, but it still smells bad and it still makes tourists go away. If we lose a third of the sound as fish habitat during the summer, that's not good. For our fisheries, we have a strong commercial fishery, but more importantly, there's a big recreational fishery here. People pay a lot of money to go out on boats to go fishing in Long Island Sound, and that money that's coming into our economy trickles down, right? So it's not just the $50 that you pay to go out on a boat and go fishing. That fishing operator buys bait and tackle and gas. He takes that $50 and he spends it at Best Buy buying an iPhone. So he's supporting that money is coming into the community and supporting the community. So when you think about what are the impacts of losing money that's going into Long Island Sound, it's not just right in Long Island Sound. It's all throughout our community. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the fisherman that has to worry. It's the guy working at the grocery store, because if the fisherman doesn't have enough money to buy food, then he's not going to buy food, and the guy that runs the grocery store isn't going to make his money either. So does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah.
I answered that quickly because I think you have better questions on your list, though.
Yeah.
Are there any major industries in our area that contribute to the creation of the dead zones, or is it more like anthropogenically related? If so, which are the major contributors?
That's a good question. Yeah, and we'll go around the sewage a little bit because you said the other group was going to talk more about sewage. Mm-hmm. Industry is very important in some areas of the country. Industry is anthropogenic as well, so you don't want to make that distinction. You mm-hmm. might make the distinction between residential and industrial. In Long Island Sound, there are pollution problems related to industry, but not necessarily hypoxia problems related to industry. There are some industries that discharge, nitrogen and phosphorus that contribute to the hypoxia problem, but it's not the 800-pound gorilla in the room, if you will. You go to the Chesapeake Bay, where there's the density of chickens is like 50 times the density of humans, and or other areas, the Pacific Northwest, where there's tons of cattle, right? Now you're going to say, okay, those industries, those are big contributors to hypoxia in those areas.
Because there's more factories there, or
because the animals contribute a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus.
Just because of the waste?
Yeah. Chicken poop is actually really, really high in nitrogen. That's why...
Is that why the Chesapeake Bay has a huge dead zone?
Yeah. Well, it's part of the reason that the Chesapeake Bay has a big
So with the Gulf as well,
Isn't the Gulf because there's a lot of rivers, like the Mississippi River leading down to the Gulf, so that the rivers collect a lot of waste and then it all pours into
Yeah. So when you think about it, right, the drainage area for Long Island Sound is something on the order of 11,000 square miles, right? Which sounds big until you think about the drainage area for the Mississippi River is like 40 times that. It's basically half the country. So any agricultural activity, any sewage that's coming from half of our country is going down the tributaries of the Mississippi and down into the Gulf of Mexico. So in Long Island Sound, we complain all the time around the water cooler. If we had a water cooler, we would complain all the time around that water cooler about how big Long Island Sound is and how people that are far away from Long Island Sound, their actions impact Long Island Sound. But when we say far away from Long Island Sound, we're thinking like Massachusetts, central Massachusetts, northern Connecticut, some portions of New Hampshire and Vermont. Oh, how are we going to deal with this? If you're in the Mississippi River, you've got people in Wisconsin. When they flush their toilets, that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. So in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So, it's a much bigger problem there. So.
Isn't there a lot of farming also mid-country? So
Yeah.
that's another problem with all the fertilizer.
Yeah. So the fertilizer
And the waste.
makes a big difference, and so the way that you manage it is very different, right? So in a highly agricultural watershed, you guys know what a watershed is? Okay. So a watershed is the area of land where if water falls on it, it ends up in a river system and then into a given estuary. So Long Island Sound watershed, the area of land where if rain falls, it ends up in Long Island Sound, goes into New York a little bit. It's all of Connecticut. There's a tiny little bit, like 20 acres of Rhode Island that's in it. And then pretty much all of Connecticut, about half of Massachusetts, and a big slice of New Hampshire and Vermont, and then another really small portion that's in Canada just to make legislation really difficult. So it's a pretty big watershed, but it's not nearly as big as in the Mississippi River system. But it means that anything that goes on in there, you're going to feel it eventually. It might take some time, but you will eventually feel the impacts from that.
So if it's not big companies and factories and industries, then what is it, like residential,
It's a lot of residential.
like fertilizer and
Yep.
stuff?
Every day you produce almost a pound of nitrogen through your landfill waste, through your sewage, and through your other activities, right? Each person produces just shy of a pound of nitrogen, about 0.9 pounds of nitrogen. So the more people you have, right, it's just simple math. Even if you take, big steps to reduce your footprint, things like being vegetarian really reduce your footprint because meat has a lot of nitrogen in it. You're still going to contribute nitrogen to the watershed. So really the biggest thing in Long Island Sound is the people.
Is there any way we can change some of our daily lives to change the amount of nitrogen that we put into the Long Island Sound? Or?
There is, and that's kind of a good question. On a personal, daily activities basis, the biggest thing that you can do is eat less meat, which I don't like the answer to that question because I'm a meativore. But that's really the biggest thing you can do. Make sure that when you buy produce, you're buying produce from farms that responsibly use fertilizer. Typically, organic farms tend to be better about that, but organic doesn't mean no fertilizer. It just means organic fertilizer. So just because it's organic doesn't necessarily mean there's less nitrogen in it, but it tends to help. Driving less does help because your vehicle emissions have nitrous oxides in them. So it's pretty much the standard suite of things, and also conserving water, right? The less water that you use, the less water ends up coming out of our aquifers and draining down into Long Island Sound. There are institutional changes that you can kind of push for, things like improving septic tanks in your homes, using low-flow toilets at your schools. When you flush a toilet, you're using several gallons of water each time. You take a shower, it's 40 or 50 gallons of water. You can put a low-flow faucet on your showers and sinks, and that will reduce your nitrogen contribution. But yeah, so it's kind of a suite of those things. The biggest thing that we're doing We're spending lots of money upgrading the wastewater treatment plants. It's kind of nice.